So I very intentionally decided to frame this book and this history and this concept around the term white feminism. Having said that, I chose to thread through a lot of what in my country, has been in some cases described as white feminism, has also been shorthanded as corporate feminism. Some feminist thinkers that I really look up to say bourgeois feminism. Other people say girl boss feminism. But the reason I really wanted to analyze a lot of this rhetoric and narrative of women's rights as one overarching white feminism is that what binds them together is this aspiration to whiteness. So not necessarily equal rights, because you are, say, like a domestic worker or a low-income woman or, a low-income trans woman. What the rhetoric of a lot of the feminism that I am tracing and that is considered like the default feminism in my country is that you aspire to essentially white privilege. You're not necessarily working towards equal rights for everybody. I think that one of the key reasons that white feminism has endured, again, as a practice and an ideology, is that it doesn't demand that institutions or powerful bodies change very much. A lot of the strategies that have been put forth by white feminists, whether we're talking about now or even 100 years ago, is crafting this very specific skill set that then, is exported to women of all different backgrounds, of different races, of different orientations to basically excel in the system as is. So if you think of, like, in my book, especially given, my work experience, I cite a lot of, white collar, like, career advice that is very framed as, feminist or feminist in tone or feminist in headline. And yet, a lot of this material that is being put in front of women to get ahead professionally is very singularly focused. You're not asked or encouraged to think about the structure of your company in a way in which it might oppress or discriminate against women. And that's really an enduring facet. And I think that's another reason why companies, to a very large extent, have been very keen to get on board with white feminism, whether we're talking about Macy's 100 years ago, or like in my country, a hypothetical like Chase Bank or, some big corporation, where again, these aren't women who are, say, unionizing. These aren't women who are challenging the structural power. They're trying to ascend within the current framework.
On that point, in terms of structure, in terms of the corporate world, shall we say, I want to read you out these questions that's just come in. This is from Anonymous, who says, I am responsible for the people strategy in my company. How do I approach issues such as representation and equality without having a, quote, white feminist focus?
I would advise two things straight off the bat. So something that I have done in my more senior roles is that I have changed a lot of job descriptions so that they are, inclusive of people who don't necessarily have lofty backgrounds, who haven't had the opportunity to secure, in some cases, what I think is an arbitrary number of years of experience, who don't necessarily have recommendations from like the most elite places. I think narrative that I've often been witness to in my career, and it sounds like this person, probably has as well, is that, you're in these highly corporate sometimes settings where people say, we want more, Black women in leadership. We want more like queer women as heads of this department. And yet the parameters by which you are supposed to hire are basically the same. Yeah. And yet if we're talking about having, women over 50 work in this workplace, if we're talking about having, women from lower middle class to like working class backgrounds, their resumes aren't going to look like the middle to upper class women who are white, who you're probably hiring on the regular. So for instance, something I've done is like I've, struck college education. I've spent a lot of years in digital media, and it's such a fast-paced in some ways like scrappy environment. And so sometimes, people having 8 to 10 years at a very elite publication, that's kind of arbitrary. That's not really necessary. And yet, that has caused tension in places that I have worked in terms of like, that is the standard, right, for who can work there. And yet, I often take the talking point of like, and that's why your entire department is white.